So firstly, thank you, John, and thank you, Renee, for the opportunity to share, and welcome fellow students. So what about the title? The convention theme this year, our journey from me to we to the oneness of all. I've taken this to mean changing our outlook from a self-centred approach coming from our lower self-personality to more of a universal approach being directed from our higher self in relation to people and everything around us. And perhaps by feeling oneness, we have the chance to act in our everyday lives for the greater good of every living thing. I like the word journey. It implies something more than a Sunday afternoon stroll. It implies something we might have to prepare for before embarking on. That led me to thinking about obstacles, and in particular obstacles in our preparation that might prevent us journeying from me to we. One of those obstacles for me is the mind, and hence the title, The Mind and Our Journey from Me to We. Unlike a lot of TS speakers and authors who can speak from direct experience, I certainly can't. The best I can do is study some of what those who profess to know have said and try to judge from a mind standpoint, at least whether it's useful. I realise a lot of what the TS espouses is about recognising that there is something beyond the mind, call it higher mind or intuition, and that it is useful to train our mind to still itself, at least temporarily, in order to let something from the higher levels to influence our lower personality, or the lower mind, emotions and physical body for the better. So while I've been in the TS a long time, I'd have to say I haven't experienced anything I recognise as a profound feeling from having tried to meditate. But perhaps like some shampoo or conditioner ad you may have heard, it won't happen overnight, but it will happen. Well, maybe in another lifetime. The best I can say from experience, however, is that it does seem to be true for me that even going through the motions of trying to meditate twice a day, it does seem to make the day flow a little more easily than on days that I haven't made the effort. So unlike most of you, at the moment I'm trapped in my mind, and so bearing in mind the convention theme, our journey from me to we to oneness of all, I thought, given the fact that some of us may be trapped in our minds, and that the mind is a really useful servant but a poor master, what can be done to train it so that it can become a more useful servant in this important journey? At some time or another, someone taking dogs for a walk, but they are really taking the person for a walk. Quite often each dog goes off in a different direction, causing a real tangle. So you can see the metaphor, I'm sure, the three dogs being the lower personality, physical body, astral body, the mind, and the person being the ego or the disciple, and hopefully the one in charge of the lower bodies. I reckon the dog on the right could represent the mind because it looks bigger and tougher than the other two and thinks it's in charge. So perhaps for a while at least the mind seems to be in control. Can we at least make it a better trained and be a team player? So HPB says in The Voice of the Silence, the mind is the great slayer of the real, let the disciple slay the slayer. And I'm sure you've all heard this before. Of course, it's easy to get confused trying to understand Theosophy, particularly when you see something such as this and then read other books which are all about mindfulness. Let me say I'm still confused, and I'm hoping that those amongst you who have managed to transcend the mind can point me in the right direction. Perhaps one way of thinking about this seeming paradox is to think about training the mind to have and use an off state, and then as well as using its normal on state. So today, rather than tackle the off state, I thought I would look at the on state and some thinking tools to train it so that it can become more useful on the journey. In At the Feet of the Master, one of the 4 qualifications for the pathway is discrimination, and I thought perhaps in our quest for mindfulness, something that aided our discrimination might help. So I came across this book that I'd been meaning to read for years.
Yes, I used to follow that.
Did you?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's published 1930. Robert H. Thulis, a lecturer in psychology from the University of Glasgow. So one of the problems I find is deciding from all the bombardment of media around one what might be true or relatively true, and how is it presented, and what are we to think or do about it? Is it possible to discern facts from opinion, relevant facts from irrelevant ones, half-truths, fake news, and so on from what we hear around us? Also, how can our theosophical lens influence our opinions? Also, a quote that Simon Webber gave me many years ago from Geoffrey Hodgson, and I hope I've quoted it correctly, goes, "A good theosophical talk consists of irrefutable facts delivered with merciless precision." Murray may be able to correct me on that. Yeah. So this book goes through a few tools one can use to help sift our information, particularly from advertising and politicians, and what to look for when debating arguments. I think it's also useful for anyone in the TS giving talks to be a bit more aware of what and how they're saying, hopefully from irrefutable facts, and perhaps more importantly, how they're constructing an argument, hopefully with merciless precision. Whether we're giving a talk, conversing or debating with someone or whatever, can we try to observe our thinking? What are we accepting or rejecting, and why? What are our opinions built on? And can we see our own conditioning? So the structure of the talk, the main ideas from the books with a few comments, and a mention of another book I think is worth reading. He talks about emotional meanings, how we describe things objectively or coloured with an opinion. For example, I am firm, you are obstinate, and he is pigheaded. They all have the same objective meaning, but firm has an emotional meaning of strong approval, obstinate has an emotional meaning of mild disapproval, and pigheaded has an emotional meaning of strong disapproval. It's not that we shouldn't use them. They are needed in poetry and literature to evoke emotion, but not where straight thinking is required. We see it in politics every day, and I suspect it has a huge effect on whether countries are at peace or war, have fair trade or not, and so on. Emotional words are generally an attempt to distort the viewer's view of the truth by arousing emotions. And I was just thinking that before, even in The Voice of the Silence, that's full of drama and colour, and it's for a reason. It's not distorting the truth, but it's to make it more dramatic, and so I think it's got its place. It certainly has. So the more important thing, apart from discerning it in what we see or hear, is also to discern it in our own thinking. After all, what we think tends to end up what we feel and then what we do. Thought leads to feeling, leads to action, generally. So the second point he makes is all and some. Statement B is dishonest if some of A is B would be true, but in which all of A is B is implied. The problem is that some A is B carries less weight and is usually not worth saying. As an example, we saw this with the language used on both sides of the debate about COVID vaccines. With the COVID epidemic, we were forced to make up our minds on incomplete evidence from both sides on whether or not to get vaccinated. The government was in a difficult position and had to act decisively, so its messages had to be strong. So we saw messages from the Director General of Health saying the vaccine is safe, implying it is safe for all, even though perhaps the statement, the vaccine is generally safe, meaning for most people it is safe, which would have been strictly more accurate but the statement would have carried less weight. Personally, I think the government did a pretty good job of their language because they were careful to qualify for safety, but in written messaging to the public, there isn't the scope for many words. Messages have to be short and to the point. Next one, dishonest tricks in argument. These tricks can apply when two people are debating, or perhaps when a politician is answering press questions. Getting an opponent to defend a more extreme position, which can then be shut down, and one which needs to be cautious to maintain a defensible position and not to defend an all argument compared with a some argument. I won't go through, I'll skip through these fairly quickly. Diversion, leaping from one conclusion to an unrelated one with no logical link. You can probably think of examples yourself. Fastening on a trivial point of an opponent and defeating it, assuming to have defeated the whole argument. Presenting so-called extremes and suggesting a compromise between them is the only answer, when the answer could actually lie with one of the extremes or neither. So I won't go into the examples, but you'll get the general idea. Logical fallacies. Some examples, all mammals are animals, or all A is B. All cats are mammals, or all C is A, therefore all cats are animals, therefore all C is A. And in this case it's true, as you can sort of see in that mathematical diagram. But we could say, try this, all dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals, therefore all cats are dogs, which is not true. So this is, in technical terms, is called the fallacy of the undistributed middle. The middle term is not distributed over the whole class of mammals. And I was just thinking as I wrote this, I think John Algeo might have written the words, Theosophy is everything, but everything is not Theosophy. Is that right? John Algeo, I think it is. I think he did write that. We also could say all dogs are mammals, all collies are mammals, therefore all collies are dogs. Now it happens to be true, but it's for the wrong argument. So we also have to be careful to use a sound reason. So, tricks of suggestion. If repetitions of statements without argument of proof are made confidently, then hearers will tend to believe them regardless of their soundness and presence or absence of truth. The prestige of the speaker, the acknowledged dignity of authority by famous authors, speakers, etc. It has probably always been the case of who you believe, because we can't individually know the truth about everything. So we believe people who we think know the truth. And we could use another way to present something by putting forward reasons for our belief and then being prepared to consider the reasons for disagreeing. This is laborious and may not lead to a feeling of absolute certainty, but it has the advantage that it is the one method by which may help both parties see, however dimly, the truth. And the Greek philosophers used this logic or dialectic as part of their trivium of grammar, logic and rhetoric, and were essential to Plato's dialogues. But this is all too slow, especially for politicians, and they tend to resort to repetition. We are all to some extent suggestible. Look at placards for elections. Often they use different phrases to say the same simple things to avoid monotony. And the other thing is sometimes there is use of jargon to infer learning. And as theosophists, we have to be careful of using perhaps Sanskrit or Hindu terms without explaining them, unless they have made it into common usage, like the word karma. So habits of thought. A speaker can start with generally approved phrases to get the audience engaged and on side, and then branch off into falsehoods. For example, statements A, B, C and D are ground bait, and then statement E has the hook. as there is interesting words. Thoughts wear pathways. The more repetition there is, the more acceptance there is, even if the statements aren't true. The apparent obviousness of a conviction is no guarantee of its truth, like the people before Copernicus thought planets revolved around a flat Earth. Our thought habits can close our minds to new truth, for example, the general theory of relativity. We judge things from our own standpoint, determined by our own conditions of life, our country, our religious or moral traditions, and we base our judgments relative to the standpoint which is not absolute. Only when we study comparative religion, morals and codes do we begin to see what extent our own opinions about right and wrong and other matters are not scientific truths. And scientific truths are true under any conditions. But our judgments whose truth is entirely relative to the point of view from which they were made. And I think Krishnamurti called this conditioning. So a useful experiment is to look at the statement expressing our own point of view on a subject on which we have well-developed thought habits, and then make no other alteration or change the particular matters with which it deals to others, just similar about which we have different thought habits. For example, consider a statement with its new subject matter. Does this attitude remain the same? So as an example, say a Russian person writes with disapproval about their own country's actions. Perhaps we approve of their honesty and courage in writing. Then switch in our minds to someone, say, from Ukraine writing with disapproval about their country's actions. Does our attitude to that person change, even though they may be just as honest and courageous for writing? These experiments may not lead us to change our opinions, but at least they should help us see the part of our judgments which are due to our thought habits, which are relative to our own limited point of view, and have a chance of replacing the imperfect opinions with judgments which are more impartial. So habits of thought continued. If we give up our old habits of thought, which are much the same as everyone else's, we haven't escaped the danger of being imprisoned by our thought habits. We might just start new habits of thoughts. Even if we become unorthodox and unconventional, we are in just as much danger of finding our minds closed to new truths by the persistence of our old habits of thought as those who are orthodox and conventional. The worst danger of all, which threatens those who reject commonly accepted habits of thoughts, is that they might fall into the habit of disbelieving things just because others believe them. Crankiness is a word for it, or in my own case I've been called a contrary sort of person. A crank is not free from thought habits, but one who has formed a thought habit which is at least likely to hide the truth, as is the opposite habit of accepting what is commonly believed. As an example of this, we saw it on both sides of the argument for and against COVID vaccination and the various mandate measures that were put in place. So can our education system produce a flexibility of mind, a way to try out new ways of thinking and make unfamiliar assumptions? In other words, putting on one side our old thought habits. We still have a world where a majority of people work for wages and salary. Can we imagine one where monetary motive would not be dominant, and yet what needed to be done for society to live was done? And by the way, has anyone read the book Looking Backwards 2000 to 1887 by Edward Bellamy, written in 1888? Conrad Jamison, some of you will know, introduced me to this Victorian novel which explores this idea. And the author of the book Straight and Crooked Thinking, written in 1930, asked about the need for marriage in its present form and whether it was the only possible one. So I'm sure that's started to change since the book was written. Of course, we can't rid ourselves of all thought habits, and nor would it be desirable. Thought habits can be useful just as bodily habits, but perhaps we can be ready to continually revise them. Can we adapt ourselves to our ever-changing environment by unceasing flexibility of mind, or will we destroy ourselves by the inflexibility of mind through wars and environmental destruction? Tabloid thinking, simplifying complex subjects into a few words. This can lead to substituting all for some and acceptance of extreme propositions. They can be easily remembered and passed from one person to another, and therefore, because more people believe or quote it, it carries the greater weight of suggestion. For example, slogans like liberty, equality, fraternity, used in the French Revolution. This simple statement really needs a complicated expansion to mean anything exactly. What are the people free or free not to do? Who are they to be fraternal to? The aristocrats or their enemies? And in what respects are they to be equal? Any expansion would not serve the purpose of the slogan. It really needs to be readily accepted in its entirety, easily remembered and able to stimulate a large number of people into similar action. There is a difficulty in grasping a complex proposition. People's brains have a limit. Then mental idleness steps in. It is easier to believe that, say, Vladimir Putin is a thoroughly bad person than to accept a dispassionate assessment of all sides of his character, or question that there is at least the least bit of doubt about the risks of vaccines in our country that currently uses. In the case of war, any belief in the bad side of a leader strengthens our convictions, while any belief in the good side would weaken our convictions. Similarly with the vaccines. It's not only on wars or epidemics we find this type of tabloid thinking. We probably all notice it in the elections. But of course, we still have to act or vote, so it's no use saying there's good and bad aspects of anything or party and I'm just not going to do anything about it. In the end, there are many cases where we just have to weigh things up and act accordingly, accepting that there is incomplete evidence. And this is a little quote from the book here. Tabloid thinking about our enemies while a war is on may help us fight effectively. Has also the continuance of tabloid thinking that contains the seeds of future wars, which may produce inconceivable disasters. If the clear thinking which sees both sides of a question made us worse fighters and better keepers of the peace, the world as a whole would be the gainer. So this was written in 1930, before World War II, and so it was quite, he could see it, obviously, happening. Pitfalls in analogy. So an illustration is something concrete to describe an idea that brings no new conclusions. For example, there is a difficulty in grasping a complex proposition. People's brains have a limit. Then mental idleness steps in. It is easier to believe that, say, Vladimir Putin is a thoroughly bad person than to accept a dispassionate assessment of all sides of his character, or question that there is at least, the author describes the evil of allowing our brains to degenerate into automatic organs, and uses the illustration like using a razor for digging the ground. And we could say these are examples of similes or metaphors. But an analogy is also something concrete, but it describes an idea that is used to deduce new conclusions. Although this wasn't in the book, I wondered if the particle and wave theory of light might fall into this category, when Thomas Young's discovery of wave interference of light in 1801 double slit experiment. Particles tend to have certain properties and waves other properties, and these were used for predicting where to look and what experiments to devise to test the properties. Our thinking has changed since that time towards a wave-particle duality, and the observer influences the results of experiments. So analogies can be a valuable guide as the direction in which to look for the truth, but never final evidence as to what we might discover. We have to use them with caution and look out for imperfect or forced analogies. So drawing the line, we're inclined to label things in a binary way, black or white, good or bad, sane or insane. But there is usually a spectrum of continuity between them. The words distinguish sharply the extremes but not the continuity, and therefore are a form of crooked thinking. But the fact there is continuity can also be used to undermine the reality of the difference. Because there is no sharp dividing line, there is no difference, for example. For example, when is a beard not a beard? 1 hair, 2 hairs, 29. Or the example of the straw that broke the camel's back, where the owner thought there was no sharp line between a reasonable load and an overweight load. So definition of terms is useful to prevent crooked thinking, but we have to be careful where there are continuities. Vagueness and related evils. We need to avoid ambiguity. In our own minds, we need to get rid of vagueness before we can combat it in another's argument. It's worth consulting definitions. Somewhere I think I read that Krishnamurti apparently liked to read dictionaries. Someone can correct me on that. It can also be helpful when talking, reading or thinking in abstract terms to keep our thought closely in contact with the real world by seeing if we can think of examples. For example, from a book on psychology comes a phrase, "The sociological value of instinct transformation lies in the fact that it can provide a socially harmless outlet for otherwise objectionable behaviour tendencies." That's a bit of a mouthful. So an example might be, it's a good thing for Tommy to play rugby because then he is less likely to make a nuisance of himself fighting other boys and being a vandal. Prejudice. We can reason logically but still come to the wrong conclusions if we are working from incorrect facts or opinions, which are prejudices. Also, we can reason illogically and still be right. So we have to watch for anger in ourselves and others who may be irritated by an argument exposing a prejudice. Emotions get involved and we may be tied to a prejudice, though the holder won't know it. We tend to believe things we desire and disbelieve the things we don't. Rationalisation. Our desires can lead us to a belief in our minds, and our minds construct a rational set of reasons for supposing it to be true. In other words, rationalisations on an irrational belief. Our prejudices lead us to overlook false thinking and writings we agree with, and our prejudices lead us to detect errors in what we disagree with. I've noticed that myself plenty of times. And our prejudices tend to make us forget facts unfavourable to our opinions. So detachment is about recognising our prejudices. So the final point he makes, straight thinking. So much for crooked thinking. What about straight thinking? Well, scientific method is one example. Weighing, measuring, calculating, without any use of emotional words, guided only by the universality of cause and effect. The results may lead to a concept that can be expressed in mathematical terms. New results cause old concepts to be modified, so all concepts are held tentatively. New concepts still express the old truth, but extended. Science can give us an ever-widening circle of knowledge. And of course, science has its own problems when the observer affects the observed. And so it has to evolve new methods, especially when dealing with the subtler forms of matter that we talk about in the TS. for which there aren't many accepted measuring devices. Nevertheless, the ideal of straight thinking by the use of scientific habit of thought to all our practical problems has the chance of replacing blind forces controlling our destinies with our own intelligent and conscious control. And it's interesting to note that in the Golden Stairs by HPB, the words sacred science are used. She uses the words, and a constant eye to the ideal of human progression and perfection, which the secret science, I should have said secret science, Gupta Vidya depicts. Admittedly, the secret science refers to a guarded, concealed or secret knowledge, but it's still a science. So, with this book written in 1930, between the world wars, it was interesting to read this comment. Until the last war, we believed in leaving the rivalry between the interests of various nations as blind and uncontrolled forces. Only a few cranks believed that men should attempt to bring them under conscious control. When these forces led to the soaking of the world in blood by a disaster which injured the victorious nations no less than the conquered, we made in the League of Nations a beginning, a very small beginning, at the attempt to control them. The world can no longer blunder into a war quite as blindly as it did in 1914, although many of the processes which lead to war still go on unchecked. The modern nations are not yet prepared to give up their sovereignty to a superstate whose aim would be the scientific understanding of the processes of international rivalry and the exercise of an authority over all nations would rob these processes of the power to produce war. So that's a little quote from the book again. And obviously it failed in its attempt to prevent another world war, although after World War II the United Nations was born out of this, this beginning of the League of Nations in 1946. But as we can see today, we're still not there yet as far as world peace goes. One thing the world does seem to be uniting on is understanding the need for action to lessen climate change. So just as a very quick summary, we've had a look at some of these tools that we can perhaps, I don't expect you to remember all these, but just be aware of as we're talking to people and making arguments or discussing. And to end up with, I'd just like to recommend this book here. You can come and see it later. Last year I was fortunate to be part of a book club based around this book by Paul Hawken, Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation, published in 2021, and I'd highly recommend it. I thought this book was extremely well balanced and a really good example of straight thinking. It's a collection of well-researched essays from eminent scientists, naturalists and scholars, along with amazing photographs. It looks at oceans, forests, wildings, land, people, cities, food, energy, industry, and ends up with action and connection. Of course, there's the doom and gloom, but balanced with stories of hope and suggestions of a way out of it. Although it is not a theosophical book, by the time you've gone through it, and I'm still going through it again, you realise a lot more just how interconnected things are in nature and the way humans interact with it and affect it. In many ways, I thought the solutions it was suggesting were an amazing example of the journey from me to we to the oneness of all. So yeah, do come and have a look at this. And if you have, has anyone read it, by the way, or been aware of it? Paul Hawken's, he's formed there's a whole sort of internet group about it. And so it's all about continuing action and connection, which is about the journey from, me to we. And of course, by acting as we have some chance of doing something, but probably acting individually, not so much. But nevertheless, a wonderful example of not necessarily optimism, but hope, but it's scientific. So I thoroughly recommend that, and I'd like to thank you for listening to that.